The following is meant for entertainment and educational purposes. It is not meant to establish a doctor-patient relationship. Please consult your mental health provider for your mental health needs. Hello, welcome to Chez Eric, my home where we talk about psychiatry and religion with a focus on how to apply it to your life. And we will be continuing with the William James series on varieties of religious experience. And this will be lecture 6 and 7 on the 6 souls. And I hope you're enjoying it because this is in contrast to the healthy minded stuff we talked about before. And I am Dr. Eric. Nice to see you again, and let's continue. Last time, we kind of went to an understanding of the very extreme versions of the morbid-minded or the sick-souled individuals, and that they, in fact, eliminate all good things. And how do they do that? And how do they understand? We kind of left off asking the question, how do we then understand their version of religiosity if they've completely eliminated all good? And William James then begins to talk about this idea of pathological depression or pathological melancholy. That's what they called it at the time. And if you remember in the beginning, William James suffered a lot from, pathological depression or depression overall. And so that's what I imagine shaped his experiences to have this gigantic lecture series and really thought deeply about it. And, I guess thankfully wrote this big, gigantic text. Although I will admit it's very hard to read, very annoying to read. Not his fault. Maybe it's my lacking, or maybe we're just in a different century, literally, but that's perfectly fine. Now, last time we also talked about this idea of twice born in contrast to once born, and that there was a shift in the philosophy at the time from the once born version of religiosity to the twice born version of religiosity that wants to acknowledge that there is a negative thing in this world and that the negative thing needs to be fixed and changed. All right. But for right now, James actually goes into a discussion about pathological melancholy, but in our terms nowadays, we would basically call it major depressive disorder. At the time with William James, they didn't have the robust knowledge of mental health that we have today. But they were kind of pioneers at the time of the mental health space. And it's these days, we have the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual for Mental Health Illness. And so we have depression, pathological depression, as a diagnosis. And there is, in fact, a lot of controversy among people over whether or not they are depressed, whether or not they need medications for depression, whether or not they are, if they really have a mental illness, right? There's a lot of controversy over drug pharmaceuticals pushing a lot of medications, and then all of a sudden making depression, more and more prevalent. Oh, you're depressed, I'll take more medications. And then there's a lot of controversy over, medicating everybody with their depression when in fact they should just be like eating vitamins or something like that, okay? And that is a very real thing. In relation to the discussion of William James and what he's talking about and religiosity, he actually tries very much to explore pathological depression to understand its relationship to religiosity. And so there is something very different with the pathological depression of feeling down, right? And it versus, another form. And I'll get into it. William James talks about this idea of anhedonia, where you feel joyless and you're dreary and you're discouraged and dejected. And he points out, even people who are on seasickness, right, will experience what he calls anhedonia, what we know as anhedonia, a lack of sort of happiness. And, it's like, it can take the form of irritation or mistrust or despair, and a lot of them are like mixed cases of it. But he says, only a small proportion of people who are anhedonic have a religious sphere. And that's what he points out. I don't know if it's still true, but you hear that out. Only a small proportion of people who he was observing who were, pathologically sad were in the religious sphere. And so he explores a particular quote from a patient in the French asylum. And this is a quote, right? And I will admit that when I read quotes, I read them really weird, but I try not to. I was kind of nervous in the previous times whether or not this would work, but I guess we'll try, right? And so I'll read this. Hopefully you can see it. It's a lot. Actually, I'll just read it to you like this. Okay. Yeah. He says, this French sort of patient in the asylum, I've suffered too much in this hospital, both physically and morally. Besides the burnings and the sleeplessness, atrocious fear presses me down, holds me without respite, never lets me go. Where is the justice in it all? What have I done to deserve this excess of severity? Under what form will this fear crush me? What would I not owe to anyone who would rid me of my life? There are limits to everything. There is a middle way. But God knows neither middle way nor limits. I say, God, but why? And all I have known so far has been the devil. After all, I am afraid of God as much as of the devil, so I drift along thinking of nothing but suicide, but with neither courage nor meals here to execute the act, O God. What a misfortune to be born like a mushroom doubtless between an evening and morning, and how true and right I was when in our philosophy year in college I chewed the cud of bitterness with the pessimists. Yes, indeed, there is more pain in life than gladness. It is one long agony until the grave. That is the quote that he has. William James points out two things from this quote. He says, first, notice how the entire consciousness is filled with a feeling of evil, that everything is lost. His attention sort of excludes everything, and he cannot admit it. So, like, he talks about God, but can only see the devil. And the second thing is that, notice he says the complaining attitude that, of his misery, the complaining attitude keeps him from taking a religious direction, right? And generally, James states that complaining, tends towards, he says, irreligion, lack of religion. So if you complain all the time, you have a tendency towards, irreligion. So what does all of this mean? Well, my understanding, I could be wrong, but I think I'm right about my understanding, is that James is saying that pathological depression is very different from what the sick souls are experiencing. And that the sick souls, when they're pessimistic, when they're sad, when they are down, they're not pathologically depressed the way this French guy in the asylum was. The French guy in the asylum, only sees evil, right? And he, completely chews out, all the, even the presence of God, and doesn't really seek that out. And so in this, we're looking at the extreme version of this, and he pointed out that this is not a religious experience per se, or this religious experience it has a tendency of irreligiosity when you're dealing with a pathological depression. At the time, he probably relied on his own personal experiences and maybe a couple of studies. They're not as robust now. I don't know if this necessarily is true, that people who are depressed necessarily have less religion. I do know that religiosity can help people with various coping mechanisms. I'm not saying that William James is true, but when we're looking at this idea of depression, like as a diagnosis, and religiosity, there seems to be, according to James, a break. And whether or not we see that break right now, well, we're going to need a lot of studies, and I can look up studies for future videos on whether or not that's true. The problem is that such studies are so controversial that it would be very hard to publish or very hard to do it without losing your career in the process of getting people angry with you. Right? So in many respects, it's going to be very challenging to really do a very, really full-scaled study on this. But I would really love, if you're an expert on this, right, and you're watching this, let me know about studies. I would love to talk about it on the channel. But as it comes to the religious experience, William James has sort of separated the pathological depression from the considerations of the sick soul to understand how pessimistic people understand religion. So when we're talking about pessimistic people, when we're talking about the sick soul and twice born, we're not talking about pathological depression, pathological melancholy, pathological things. That seems to be something completely different entirely that William James has done. Whether it's right or wrong, let me know. Do you believe that there's a relationship between being pathologically depressed or, sort of a diagnosed with major depressive disorder and not religious? Or maybe that's not true, or maybe there's a different correlation, or maybe it's the opposite way around, or something like that. What are your thoughts? Let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you next time. Bye. Hey, how's it going? Check out my new website. It's available now. You can learn more about me. You can also check out some things I'll be offering in the future, webinars, books, and whatnot. It's a fancy website with a lot of moving parts, designed by someone who's very, very talented. So check it out when you get a chance. All right, I'll talk to you later.